Suffrage is a government term, but it's also a term that we use in politics and things, and it equals the right to vote. You'll hear it when you hear about women's suffrage, or that's the main one that we saw in history, but it's used in many cases, but it's basically the right to vote. At the writing of the Constitution, only white male property owners would have the right to vote. Today, the American electorate, the total potential voting population, is many more people. There's about 230 million people. Almost all citizens are 18 years or old, qualified to vote within reason if they're citizens and they're 18. The growth in qualified voters is due specifically to changes in the legal definition of suffrage. In other words, more people can now vote because of new laws throughout the years that changed who could vote and who could not vote. Over the history, we're adding citizens' right to vote. Number one, white males without property got the right to vote. They also basically got rid of the religious tests, and these were in the 1800s to the 1850s. In the second group is black males were allowed to vote with the 15th Amendment. That was February 3rd, 1870s when it was ratified. You can't discriminate against people based on race and color, and you had to allow them to vote. Number three, women got the right to vote, granted the right to vote in basically August 18th, 1920. That's when the amendment was ratified. It was the 19th Amendment. And then number four, going in 1961, residents of Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, are allowed to vote for president. This was the 23rd Amendment. It was ratified March 29th, 1961. Then another thing which basically helps people, and it's not a group of people, but the elimination of the poll tax, the 24th Amendment, that was ratified January 23rd, 1964, and that helped black people actually get a chance to vote. And they were allowed to vote with the 15th Amendment because they were denied to pay taxes. This is kind of what had eliminated and make them able to vote. And then the last thing is 18-year-olds were granted the right to vote with the 26th Amendment. That was passed July 1st, 1971. And basically, there's two terms: voting age participation and voting eligibility participation. Voting age is what percentage of the voting age people actually vote. In 2012, there was 235,248,000 adults of voting age. And of those that actually did vote, there was only 129,235,000, or 54.9% of the voting age population voted. So what that means is 106,013,000 adults did not vote in 2012 for some reason. The voting eligibility participation (VEP), 222,474,111 adults. They were of voting age and they actually registered to vote, so they're eligible to vote. They just didn't do it. So you have the same number, 129,235,000 adults that voted out of that registered. So 58.08 was the voter turnout in 2012. Also, 93,239,111 did not vote. These are a lot of people that are not voting in elections, and our percentages are lower than other countries. Now, a tax on suffrage, just for your history lesson, what we have is Congress and states have passed laws in the past in the 1800s stopping Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, Native Americans from voting in the 1800s and 1900s. Eventually, all of these groups, through Supreme Court or national congressional laws, were allowed to vote. With African Americans, we used the following things to stop African Americans from voting. Even though it was the 15th Amendment, we used the poll tax. You actually had to pay a fee to vote, and if you couldn't pay the fee, you didn't vote, and this hurt blacks and whites. The literacy test was a requirement to read to be able to vote. A property test, you had to own property to vote. Grandfather clause said, well, it allowed illiterate whites to vote, but not blacks, if one of their relatives before 1865 was actually allowed to vote. There was a white primary, which basically they called the Democratic Party a club, and it did not allow blacks into the club, so they could not vote in the Democratic primary. Violence, threats, you could lose your job, beatings, lynchings, trying to force blacks not to vote. There were purges. If you were actually a registered voter, you could actually have your name taken away from the registration or your list as a registered voter. You couldn't vote until after the election. And then obviously you would arrest somebody, for whatever reason, because former prisoners, people that were arrested, were not allowed to vote. So all of these eventually have changed, but currently, right now, we see a rise in the need to do a literacy test or to make people say, okay, you're smart, you have to take a government test, or there's now the right for ID. So the ID is actually a tax, and the ID stops blacks and elderly from voting. So there's still a tax on voting rights. Some of them are illegal, but there's a want to actually do this again because elections are about winning. It's not about who's the most votes, but it's winning the election. So these are the things about suffrage, and this is very interesting. If you have any questions, ask in class.